Hey guys, it's Will with Hong Kong Cinema Appreciation Society. This is why I like this movie. Today we're going to be talking about Black Lizard. This is a Shaw Brothers movie. It was released in 1981, and I really love this movie, and I've watched it several times. And there are people who really don't like this movie, and people who have just never seen this movie because it's not one of the more well-known Shaw Brothers films. It was directed by Chor Yuen, who also did Bat Without Wings, Death Duel, various other Shaw Brothers films. It stars Derek Yee, who's very famous, and then a number of other kind of like regulars from Shaw Brothers films. The best way I can describe this movie, I was like thinking really hard how to describe it. Imagine a Scooby-Doo episode written by Shakespeare, produced by the Shaw Brothers. It's like a supernatural movie that is at its core a mystery, but the mystery revolves around like decades-long intrigue and drama between these two families. And the two families' houses abut one another, and it's almost like this huge kind of sprawling mansion. And there's also like this kind of mysterious villain's lair. And in that aspect, there's also like an obvious influence to me from Universal monster films, because if you look at, Frankenstein less so, but definitely with Dracula, with Wolfman, with the Mummy, you typically have some kind of central building, be it the, in I believe in both Dracula and in Wolfman, there's like a central mansion. And in Frankenstein, you have the castle, and then you have the little town next to the castle, then there's a town in Wolfman. And in the Mummy, you have kind of like the place that they're staying and doing their research, right? I don't remember if it's a hotel or... And then you have the monster's lair. So you have the place that the Mummy came from, and you have kind of like the woods, spooky kind of area where Wolfman is. And in Dracula, you have Dracula's castle, right? And so it's this kind of like concentrated thing of major locations, one of which is kind of like the good guy's place, and one of which is kind of like the bad guy's place. And so this plays to that convention. And that convention has also been adopted by Guillermo del Toro. And so I also see Guillermo del Toro influence in this film. I'm a huge fan of Guillermo del Toro. And if you look at Devil's Backbone, Pan's Labyrinth, and Crimson Peak in particular, you see basically an identical narrative pattern. People are going to have gripes with that and be like, well, those characters are all really different and the plot unfolds in different ways. If you boil it down to its basest, most abstract elements, each of those films takes really interesting characters who have really deep secrets that are very kind of dark, violent, and twisted, and that have some of them outsized, almost like deranged ambition. And you put those people in one place and you kind of lock them there, right? So in Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth, we're locking them there with war. In Crimson Peak, they're locked there by the isolation of where they are, by the economic needs of the character, by the fact that the wife is from the United States, so she's completely alone there, right? And then there's a snowstorm that kind of traps them there. And this movie has a very similar kind of narrative pattern. Like you have these two families and their houses are there, so they're trapped into these houses, and there's a supernatural element. There's this kind of like ghost story mythology, and also a lot like Guillermo del Toro. In almost every Guillermo del Toro film, there's an opening sequence that explains a mythology that carries on throughout the whole film, right? So this is in both the Hellboy movies, this is in Pan's Labyrinth. You see this a lot in Guillermo del Toro's films. And in this movie, you open with a little explanation of this kind of legend of this black lizard that lives in this lake that comes out every 3 years, and then like bad and weird things start to happen. And so this is all kind of this like milieu in which this film takes place. And one of the things that I really love about Black Lizard is obviously very influenced by British things. Hammer films, Sherlock Holmes, there's even some Bond influence, particularly in the villain, who is like this like throw his head back and cackle like over the top guy. And also their like characters are wearing disguises, and it's like this Mission Impossible Bond kind of thing. And I know Mission Impossible is American, but this movie obviously does have some influence from Bond films. And that they kind of like the cultural transposition that they do, but they take this influence from Hammer films, and they take this influence from James Bond, they take this influence, very obvious influence from Sherlock Holmes, because you have a mystery and there's supernatural things happening, but the onus is on the detective to determine whether or not there actually is supernatural stuff at play, or if someone is messing with your head, which becomes a very interesting element to the film that I'll kind of go into detail on in a second here. But to take all these British things and to put them in this Chinese context and to make it a Shaw Brothers film with like the sword fights and stuff is just really, really interesting to see how that works and how those influences play out. There's also this very Hitchcockian element to this film where the characters in the film are playing kind of mind games with each other. I don't want to give too much away here, but the filmmakers play mind games with you, right? So the filmmakers know that the audience who's going to see this film has seen certain types of films before. They've seen supernatural films, they've seen horror films, and they've seen martial arts films. And it takes tropes from all of those movies, and it plays with them in ways that you don't expect, and it gives you things that you didn't realize you were going to see. In the film, the characters use the mythology of the film's world to mess with the other characters. So it's like this kind of weird meta device where the movie is doing things to you that the characters are doing to one another in the movie. And it's really cool. There's a great ambiance in this film. The music is really, really good, and it takes from a number of elements. So like I said, it came out in 1981, so it does have like some kind of like synthesizer-y, spooky, eerie 80s kind of music, but then there's also like more traditional stuff that you'd expect to hear from Shaw Brothers. It has great, great sets, like all Shaw Brothers movies do. And this movie is extremely well conceived. So what do I mean by that? It's 82 minutes long. That's really short, and that includes the credits. So the actual movie is probably like 80 minutes or something like that. And it wastes no time whatsoever in anything. You have this big opening scene. It's almost like The Godfather, where it's a big wedding. And you meet all of the characters, and you learn all of their relationships to one another, and you learn the mythology of the film. And then we skip ahead to a few years later, and the plot has started. And there's no wasted space anywhere. And there's a lot of mysteries happening in this movie. It's like mysteries within mysteries within mysteries. And every scene that solves one mystery or gives you information that will help you kind of start putting the pieces together also gives you another question. Literally until you get to the very, very end. There's no denouement, there's no like characters talking afterwards like, man, wasn't that crazy? Like it really does carry you to the very, very end. And that's when you find out like the last piece of the puzzle. And the script is really well put together in that way. And the way that this movie is conceived has led some people to say, and I've read like some little like blog pieces, reviews and stuff like that about this movie, that it's convoluted. And I completely disagree with that. And I would think that I would argue that the idea that it's convoluted comes from a few different things. One, it's complicated. And so you have to pay attention. But it is not convoluted. Like there's never a point at which you're like, this doesn't make sense, or I have no idea what's going on. If you follow it carefully, it makes perfect sense. It's just a very dense movie. There's a lot of information in it, and there's a lot of mystery, and there's a lot of kind of like plot twists and stuff like that. The other thing I would say is that I would argue that this is kind of true of East Asian films in general, and by East Asian films, I guess I mean predominantly South Korean films, Hong Kong films, and Japanese films. But in particular, Hong Kong films, their narratives don't hold your hand in the way that American cinema holds your hand. And American screenwriters very much guide you through the movie. And they tell you where you are in the story. They tell you what's come before. They tell you what to expect in the future. And sometimes, obviously, they invert your expectations because that keeps the movie interesting. But there are place marks along the way in American mystery films that help you sit for a second, gather the information, and figure out where you're going. Hong Kong films don't do that typically, at all, in any way. Infernal Affairs is a movie that to a T embodies that aspect of, we're not going to tell you anything, we're just going to give it to you, and you have to follow it. And if you are conditioned to watching American films and you were to watch The Departed, which is a remake of Infernal Affairs, and then watch Infernal Affairs, you'd be like, I like The Departed more because I know where I am along the story. Whereas if you prefer that Hong Kong style of filmmaking where you really just have to get it as it's coming at you, Infernal Affairs is a much better film because it doesn't baby you, it doesn't hold your hand. And this movie is very much of that mold. Like, there's no point at which it's like, okay, let's sit down for a second and talk so you know where we are in the film. It's like, we're just going to go, and there's no time wasted on catching the audience up on anything. So this is a really great movie. Truly, truly, I can't recommend it highly enough. It's probably my favorite. Well, I don't know if it's my very favorite Shaw Brothers movie. It's like one of my top 5 Shaw Brothers films. It's super underrated. It's super underseen, and it's just a great, really fascinating film to study as an act of taking influence from all these different places and making a coherent, singular whole that doesn't seem like a ripoff of all these different things, and that works really well on its own. So, Black Lizard, Shaw Brothers film, released in 1981. Go check it out.